In part two, the linguistics of the English spelling system in relationship to the semantic and context and the limitations of fMRI technology, Dr. Strauss addresses the basic questions related to the English spelling system and the role of semantics in meaning making and how context changes the neural basis of perception and language. He also addresses more in depth the limitations of the fMRI technology.
Let me go through some examples from another aspect of science of reading research by the neuroscientists who use functional MRI and a certain view of language. The view being we're not studying real language texts. They claim that that how fortunate we are that because we have to turn visual language into oral language, we are so lucky that the alphabet actually provides a very neat means to do it. There is a systematic and conventional relationship between the letters and sounds. Just imagine if there wasn't. Well, they admit that in English, there are a whole bunch of exceptions, but there are languages like Italian and others where there are virtually no exceptions. They lament this, they lament that fact, and they point out that English readers may make a lot of mistakes and Italian readers may not. The mistakes are simply that the English readers may mispronounce words because the letter sound relationships are not what they are in Italian. And researchers like Professor Dahan conclude that we must have spelling reform. Well, this is based on their view that you have to be able to easily sound out words. English has a spelling system which is not easy. There are so many words that are spelled unlike the way they seem to be pronounced, and that is a sorry state of affairs. So here's another slide that I apologize for if it's not easy to read. They do not understand, and I'll put it that bluntly, they do not understand, well, not only the difference between text and abstract language, but the nature of the English writing system. We need to understand that there's more than one type of writing system. Alphabetic is one, where letters seem to stand for sounds, but logographic is another. Here you see Chinese characters where each character represents an entire word, a logos, a word. So one character you'll see is pronounced li, which means inside. The other character is pronounced gin. I know I'm not saying it right. And that means roots. But when you say li, gen together, they use this sequence of two characters, each representing a whole word in their language. They're using it for their sounds to be able to write the word Reagan, as in President Reagan, Reagan. They take logographic characters and they use it in an alphabetic way. It's a hybrid. Their language is actually a hybrid. If you look at, oops, that's not what I wanted to go to. Let's see. In English, look at the words sane and sanity, beat and beat, steak, and so on. These are words, they're very common, everybody knows about this, that are spelled differently but pronounced the same. And people who think that we have to have a transparent alphabetic system where each letter stands for a sound and that we therefore need spelling reform in English have a lot of trouble with this. Why don't the letters change when the sound changes? Sane with letter A should change to a different vowel letter because the A converts to A. Why do we have this different spellings for beat and beat when they're pronounced the same? And so on. Well, the answer is that English also is partly logographic. When we have a word like beat, B-E-A-T, and a word like beat, B-E-E-T, there is a purpose served by those two different spellings. It tells us that those are two different words, even though they are pronounced the same. The question that the science of reading people ask is the wrong question. They ask, why are we putting up with a writing system that produces so many mistakes, that is not transparent? The real question is, why does the English alphabet fully tolerate this? Why does it go on for decades and decades and centuries without imposing hardships? Of course, the SOR people says that this is the source of dyslexia. It's a very silly argument, but we'll get to. But we can see that not only is Chinese a hybrid of logographic and alphabetic function, but so is English. That's a very interesting scientific finding. Something which is not in the reach of science of reading researchers. Spelling in English is influenced by many things other than sounds. Here you see silent E in a variety of words. Bounce, chance, and so on in the first line, rinse and sense. What is the function of silent E? You can see it's not to make the preceding vowel long. Mince is not pronounced mince. Lance is not pronounced lance. We're all taught that silent E makes the preceding vowel long, but it doesn't in this. What does it do? Well, it prevents these words from being pronounced bank, chank, dank, frank, henk, lank, and mink. It prevents the preceding C from being pronounced k. It allows it to be pronounced so, which is one of its pronunciations. Rinse, sense, and tense would be pronounced rins, sens, and tens without the E. That's not saying anything about the preceding vowel. What about blue, Q, do, sue, and true? Well, there's a spelling rule, not a phonics rule, a spelling rule in English that does not allow words to end in U, with rare exceptions, like the animal new, GNU, and so on. What's the function of E? Well, it allows the word to end with the pronunciation U, but not end with the letter U. Same thing with cave, clove, dive, and so on. English spelling does not allow words to end in V, unless it's like a shortened name, like Bev for Beverly. But those are the only exceptions. What is E doing in this case? It's preventing the words from ending in an illegal letter, V at the end of the word. And bike, crane, dune, and stone, and Pete follow this same logic. It's not that the letter E is causing the preceding vowel to be long, bike, crane, and so on. It's preventing it from being short. And there are linguistic arguments we can make that the preceding vowel has a default pronunciation, which feeds into that explanation. So here again are examples of English logographic writing. Again, some examples. In his book, Dahan says that he notes the word sane and sanity, and he says, well, the reason we don't change the spelling is because that would be silly. That's the word he uses, it would be silly. Not a very good scientific explanation. I don't think things happen or not because they're silly. Here's another set of phonics rules. When the letter W begins a word, I'll only do that one for the purpose of not spending too much time on this. Look at all the different ways the letter A can be pronounced. Wad, wag, wall, war, was, and way. As opposed to, bad, bar, ball, and so on. They're completely different letters. So a phonics rule would have to say, well, if a word ends in W and ends in D, the letter A is pronounced ah. If the word has W followed by the letter A and ends in G, it's pronounced eh. If a word begins in W, has a letter A, and ends with LL, the A is pronounced aw. Those are a lot of phonics rules to remember. I don't think anybody really does remember them. We read in a very different way. Here's an interesting point about phonics rules that the science of reading people never, ever, ever talk about. There are things that are sounded out in words, if we want to accept the sounding out view of reading, which do not come from the letters. So where do they come from? For example, an accent in a word. There is no symbol which represents an accent. Other languages do, but not English. So how do we explain that there are words like console and console, two different words, convict and convict, object and object, and so on? How do we explain that there are pairs of words that differ only in the accent. Well, the accent difference will have an effect on the vowels, but the main thing is the accent. Where does it come from? It can't come from the letters. How do they explain that? They really have no explanation of it. How do you explain that the sentence that contains the words, "What are you afraid of?" can be pronounced, "What are you afraid of?" or "What are you afraid of?" If they don't use context, they have no explanation for it. It's really only context that will tell you which word gets accented. The letters cannot do it. In other words, converting letters into sounds, if you want to identify words, if that's your goal, if you accept as an SOR person, converting letters into sounds will only get you part of the way, because there are more sounds than just consonantal and vowel sounds. There are also accent sounds. Converting letters to sounds is impossible, and that's why I wrote, try teaching that to beginning readers, those W words. All right, here's a very interesting article by a set of researchers. Professor Desai was kind enough to actually respond to me when I wrote to him with some questions about this article. I can tell you that other people I've written to have not emailed me back, but Dr. Desai was very gracious, and I'd like to thank him for it. These researchers understand that we need to really look at naturalistic reading in order to understand reading. They make the mistake of thinking that stringing sentences together is naturalistic, but I mentioned earlier that a stop sign is also naturalistic. In any case, they are trying to understand sentences. One of the indications that they know that an fMRI machine has limitations when they study sentences, when the input is sentences, apart from it has to do with that problem with temporal resolution. You can read the whole sentence, but the MRI machine is only going to give you the signal a few seconds after it got the input, which means it's best to just give it a very short input, not something really long. Well, here's what they do to solve the problem. They supplement the fMRI machine, which is good at spatial resolution. Where in the brain is this taking place? We're good at that. They supplement it with eye movement studies, because they know that eye movement studies are outstanding in temporal resolution. You know immediately by looking at where the eyes are, what the eyes are looking at. It doesn't take a delay. You know it right away. Well, of course, the socio-psycholinguistic model of reading has known this for many, many years, and has taught all of us, except for people who ignore it, a lot about the reading process. It's good to see that some neuroscience researchers who use fMRI are realizing that the fMRI machine does not give all the answers. So they do write that the high temporal resolution eye tracking is added to the low temporal resolution fMRI signal, which is called the bold signal. That has to do with the blood movement. And they therefore added eye movement to fMRI. That's an implicit recognition of the limitations of fMRI. And now they're able to take their pictures. They put sentences in, had the subjects, they looked to see if the subjects could recognize a certain kind of noun. How did they know that the subjects were looking at the noun? From the eye movement, from the eye tracking machine. They eliminated any and all subjects from the experiment who did not focus on the noun they were interested in, and were able to take these MRI pictures showing where in the brain the readers processed those specific nouns they were interested in. But they had to do it. They could only do it by using eye movement studies. Very interesting. They don't really show the eye tracking from the machine, but they do give some temporal information in this chart. There are quite a number of functional MRI studies that combine eye tracking with the MRI machine. In other words, a number of these researchers understand that we need something with good temporal resolution. Eye movement is that. Eye movement miscue analysis is that too. EEGs, a test that you might get if we're looking for seizures, has excellent temporal resolution. An EEG, an electroencephalogram, shows the electrical activity of the brain. We see it virtually immediately when the neurons light up. They've tried to combine also EEG, excellent temporal resolution, with functional MRI, poor temporal resolution, but good spatial resolution. EEGs have very poor spatial resolution. You can see immediately where the nerve cells get active, but you don't really know in a whole lot of detail what part of the brain it's coming from. Here's a statement from one of a number of articles where the researchers are also understanding that the fMRI machine is limited because it doesn't take context into account. And they say that there are a lot of studies where, God, we wish we could look at context, because generally the research that's done with functional MRI on reading looks at decontextualized paradigms. What we would really like to know is what readers do when there's a context. So they set up an experimental design that has context, and they show that the part of the brain that lights up when context is provided is different than when context is not provided. That is also a very important finding. Here's another article, I'm just showing the title basically, of researchers looking at how context changes the neural basis of perception and language, which is getting closer to looking at natural language. Many of them want to do it. They recognize the limitations of functional MRI with its poor temporal resolution, its complete lack of context, and are trying to get into that. Let me see if I can move this so I can see something better. Another article that is talking about the temporal limitations, and that you can see at the bottom, they use eye tracking to supplement the technical limitations.